Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of the Lutyens Trust America and the Lutyens Trust, I'd like to welcome you to our 21st webinar. Today, we're looking at Lutyens elevation designs. During the course of the last several months, I've been privileged to work with our panelists, Oliver Cope and Stuart Martin. They did a wonderful job presenting our webinar last year on Lutyens plan, so we asked them to come back and talk about Lutyens elevations this year. As the title of the webinar indicates, it was a process of evolution and revelations. And as with all things Lutyens, the more you delve into his work, the more you find. And that's certainly proven to be the case preparing for this webinar. We've had some great conversations. So let me introduce Oliver and Stuart to you. Oliver Cope received an AB from Harvard College in 1980, a Master of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design in 1985, and taught as a visiting assistant professor of architecture at the University of Cincinnati before establishing the firm of Oliver Cope Architect in New York City in 1988. A comprehensive architectural design firm with a solid base of experience in diverse projects, the firm is especially strong in traditional design and classically American homes in a variety of historic styles. Widely recognized as one of the premier firms for traditional residential architecture in the New York area, Mr. Cope's work is featured in the firm's monograph, Oliver Cope Architect, City, Country, Sea, published by Triglyph Books with an introduction by Clive Aslett. The firm's work has also been featured in numerous architectural and design publications. Stuart Martin first encountered Lutyens through the Patrick Nuttgens TV program that coincided with the Hayward Gallery Exhibition on Lutyens in 1981. He pursued this interest at Nottingham University, writing a dissertation on the development of Lutyens classical architecture and beginning his own solo visits to the houses when he could. In his subsequent career as an architect of country houses, Stuart has sought to combine his reverence for Lutyens' work with its love of traditional forms and materials, with sensitivity to the varying context of our own times. He's been a member of the Lutyens Trust for over 20 years, a member of the events committee for more than 10 years, and has recently become a volunteer caseworker for the Trust. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll compile these questions and present them to the panelists at the end of the presentation. Previous webinars can be found on our website and on the Lutyens Trust America YouTube channel. Now we'll begin. Given that we had less than an hour to explore a topic as broad as Lutyens elevation designs, one of our major tasks was to figure out which houses to use as illustrations. The idea was to find keys to understanding why Lutyens elevations are so satisfying to the eye, and to see if those keys or themes hold true across a range of designs. The four houses we'll look at today vary widely in style, client, location, and time period within Lutyens' career. Tigbon Court, one of Lutyens' Surrey houses, was designed relatively early in his career in 1899 and showcases Lutyens' skill in working in the arts and crafts style. Built for Edgar Horn, an MP for Guildford and director of the Prudential Insurance Company. Lutyens' client for Homewood, built in 1901, was the Dowager Lady Lytton, his mother-in-law. There's a freedom and innovation to this design, perhaps because it was intended for a family member, allowing Lutyens the opportunity to experiment. Homewood is located in Hertfordshire. For Middlefield, we moved to Cambridgeshire in 1908, finding Lutyens working in an austere form of Neo-Georgian. The site was a windswept hill outside of Cambridge. His client, a Cambridge dean, Dr. Henry Bond of Trinity Hall. The classicism of our last house, Gledstone Hall, built in 1922 to 25, is an interesting contrast to the other three houses. Located in Yorkshire, Gledstone Hall was built for Sir Amos Nelson, a wealthy industrialist, who made his fortune in cotton mills. Now I've introduced you to our houses. Let me talk about our themes for a minute. Lutyens was an enigma, is an enigma. Why do his elevations feel so right? His son, Robert, wrote a book about his father, An Appreciation in Perspective. One of the chapters described in detail the armature of planes as a visualization of Lutyens' design techniques. Robert wrote that his father, who is entirely pragmatic, is unlikely to recognize himself in these pages. And in fact, Sir Edwin, according to his daughter Mary, claimed he could not understand a word of it. So we're not claiming to have found the secret to designing like Lutyens. Oliver and Stuart are offering their insights into aspects of Lutyens' design that help to explain why his elevations are so pleasing. The first two themes are interrelated: geometry and the relationships and ratios. Looking at the elevation, certain shapes become apparent as the basis behind the design and are repeated throughout. How does the roof relate to the body of the building? Are there angles that repeat throughout? In other words, how each individual element relates to the concept as a whole. The third theme, materiality, can be thought of as Lutyens' artistic palette. The use of local materials and craftsmanship tie back to his earliest practice and the beliefs that underlie the arts and crafts movement. The material choices not only reinforce the sense of place, but the architectural style. We'll touch briefly on our fourth theme, the relationship of the exterior to the interior, a continuation of our webinar on Lutyens' plans. The relationship of the exterior elevations to the interior plan is often unexpected and adds to the sheer joy of Lutyens' designs. Lastly, note the differences in the entrance, side, and garden elevations in these four houses. The entrance is typically more formal with less plantings in comparison to the softer, more relaxed garden facades that are designed to create an interaction between the house and the garden, between the interior and the exterior. And now I'll turn over to Stuart and Oliver.
Thanks, Robin. So first of all, we need to remember that Lutyens used tools specific to his time, and he only used a T-square, a 45-degree set square triangle, a 30-60 triangle, compasses and scale rule. And in addition, we know that he worked almost always on squared paper, especially when working out his early designs. And I think that this means that the relationships that are easy to create with these tools often occur in his designs, whether they're squares, rectangles of that 30-60 proportion, circles and arcs of circles. It's over to you, Oliver, I think. Okay.
Well, I think the key here is that in this slide, these quotes from a draftsman, Mr. Lloyd in Lutyens' office, is important to this discussion because then they reinforce the notion that these are tools. I'll read this and then I'll read the next couple and then we'll revisit them as we go through the other slides. You were generally fairly clear from your original instructions of the elements of the composition, of the essential rhythm of the pattern, and even if this sometimes led to fantastic fractions, the basic reason was always simple. There were elementary rules which once seized had to be applied throughout the whole building or composition. For instance, all window panes had to be identical in proportion, generally in that of a square to its diagonal in height. If the key arch of a design was, say, 1.5 squares to the spring, all others would echo or fundamentally change that ratio. The nearly similar was not accepted. All moldings, with the exception of an occasional cymo, were set at an angle of 54 degrees, 45 minutes to the horizontal, thereby attaining a true 45 degree on the miter. Roofs follow suit, being only, as it were, major moldings. And we'll show you some illustrations of exactly those things in a little bit. Never is a word Lut would not accept. He made his rules, but was not a slave to them, and would shake the purist by occasional arbitrary and unexplained departure from them. The next
How's that?
slide. All right, Stuart, take it away here.
Thanks very much, Oliver. Yeah, this brings us to Tigbourne Court, which I think is one of Lutyens' most successful vernacular designs, developing from the vocabulary that he'd established for himself at Munstead Wood and Orchards in the preceding couple of years. Unlike Munstead Wood or Orchards, though, Tigbourne stands right on the public road, and this strongly influenced the entrance front, which required a design that made a public statement at the same time as the house stepped back away from the highway. And these conditions motivated Lutyens to create one of his first fully symmetrical facades, although the house behind characteristically is not symmetrical at all in its arrangement. This entrance front is set between projecting wings, enlivened at their ends by being curved in plan and supporting characteristically immense chimneys. The main elevation set back between the wings has 3 gables above 3 slender pedimented windows and the entrance porch at the bottom. This is Lutyens' original elevation design drawing. I've highlighted the roofs myself in red as it makes the drawing easier to read because it's rather faint. At this stage in his career, Lutyens was already fully in control of the vernacular forms of Surrey architecture that he'd known since his youth, and was already unrivaled among his peers in his ability to compose with these forms to create surprisingly new and beautiful compositions. Here on the following few slides, we can see how Lutyens uses basic and quite simple geometric shapes, the square and the 30-60 rectangle that we've already talked about, to define his elevations. The point, I think, is the balance between the pictorial composition and conception of each side with this geometry that Lutyens uses to control the elements that constitute it. So here I've highlighted the fact that on the main entrance facade, the whole facade is enclosed by a simple single square, which is the basis, I think, of its satisfactory nature. There are other important repetitions of the square on the other elevations as well, including the entrance porch and on the east facade, which we'll look at in a minute. And highlighted here in blue, the 30-60 rectangles are also employed to define and relate the other elevations one to another. There are as many square relationships in the design as really as we care to look for. I mean, this is how many I could find spending a few minutes with a 45-degree set square overlaying it on this entrance elevation. And the repetition of these simple shapes gives the eye surety and I think lends the design a harmony. And of course, all that's in 2 dimensions, but the building exists in 3-dimensional reality and is built out of a beautiful array of local materials. The walls are the Bargate stone, the local Surrey stone. And here, the joints are what's called garroted, which means that each individual lime mortar course has chips of ironstone pressed into it as it sets. It's originally thought that that was done to strengthen the mortar joint, but Lutyens is using it entirely decoratively here, along with his courses of roof tiles, which run straight across the facades all the way around the house in horizontal lines. But within each line, you can see he's enlivened them again by setting the tiles in a herringbone pattern, and the coins are of brick. And brick also fills the little pediments over the first floor windows that we talked about before. And the vivacity and liveliness of this vernacular treatment of the material develops from Munstead wood, but it's calmed by the classical treatment of the porch below. And I think this might be the first time that Lutyens uses a full classical order externally in any of his work. Around the corner, the south elevation, the composition is more noticeably vernacular and asymmetric, more relaxed, consisting essentially of a double-gabled main block of 3 stories, combined with a single-story wing to the left that contains the drawing room. The roof pitch is 51.5, which is a commonly seen pitch roof on the old buildings in Surrey. So back to Lutyens' elevation drawing again. And here we've highlighted the center lines of the gables together with the axis of symmetry highlighted in blue between those two main gables, where you might expect to find the garden door, but this is not the case. And shown dotted is where the left-hand edge of the left-hand gable would be if Lutyens had allowed it to be fully on view. What Lutyens does is he overlaps the single-story element across the facade of the gables. This, in effect, locks the forms together and creates a sort of visual push, which I've tried to indicate by the yellow arrows. And this visual push knocks the garden door off axis and also pushes the right-hand window, which is highlighted yellow, out of alignment with the windows above. It's Lutyens' sensitivity to this kind of artistic composition which unifies all the elements of this facade, making it so interesting and satisfying, and it becomes an integrated whole rather than just a collection of disparate parts which happen to find themselves next to each other. Around the corner on the east elevation, the game changes. The scale is much smaller, the composition is much more compact. It's charming and romantic with a delicate covered balcony counterbalanced by the arched loggia on the right. Here's Lutyens' drawing again. Here's the controlling square. And here's the axis of the square dividing perfectly between the roof and walls and dividing the wall itself into two distinct halves. The right-hand half, the arches and the windows above, again, repetitions of the square proportion. And on the left-hand half, the same square that we saw in the base of the arches, repeated 3 times in a sort of stack to enclose the balcony, which just breaks the eaves line and again creates one of these sort of visual pushes upwards, which I think counteracts the sort of earth downward solidity of the arches that gravitate and pull down. And both halves of the elevation are symmetrical within themselves, although they form part of an asymmetrical composition. And then between the center lines, we can see that there is an implied square which overlaps the main center line of the facade. I think this overlapping of these relationships knits the design together in a similar way that we saw on the south side. Nothing exists on its own. And all this geometry is basically used by Lutyens in service to his original inspiration and poetic idea, that of the delicacy of the almost suspended feeling of that balcony, in counterpoint to the robust solidarity of the arches on the right. Next, Oliver will look at Homewood.
Thanks, Stuart. That's just lovely. So Homewood is one of my personal favorites. When we visited, one of my colleagues along told me that I should stop smiling because it was starting to make her uncomfortable. As Robin said, this house was designed for Lutyens' mother-in-law, Lady Lytton, and I can only imagine the pressure he felt. This entry elevation faces generally north, and it's interesting to look back at Tigbourne also with the triple gables. And when we turn to the west side elevation on the garden, he also drops to 2. So just an interesting analogy between the two. Note the changing pitch of the roofs as they descend. There is the 51.5 degree pitch on the upper portion, and then it slopes at a lower pitch down below where it ties into the projecting wings. Also note the consistent eave line that's tracking all the way around the building. In this slide, I have another quote by Mr. Lloyd describing Lutyens' use of certain angles. In early days, the angle of his roofs was 51.5 degrees, that of the pyramid. Well, the pyramid at Giza it is. But the angle of 45 minutes being formed by the relation of the square to its diagonal, and ruling as it also did in rectangles, was adopted and rarely departed from in the last 30 years. I'm showing the construction, which is very simply done with 2 equilateral triangles. And then you take, that allows you to develop a radius. And when you turn the radius down to the baseline with an arc, and then connect to the vertex in the center, you have the 51.61 degree angle, which is close to the 51.5 described. I'm going to explore the use of some of Lutyens' favorite angles and geometries as a tool for controlling the composition of the facades. We're just dipping our proverbial toes in here, but let's see what we see as we go along. Certainly there's an element of romance by drawing inspiration from the geometry of pyramids, but there's an also elemental pragmatism in choosing a set of relationships so straightforward in their geometric construction. This is the 1 to 1.5 proportion mentioned as a common ratio. It's simply taking a square, taking the diagonal of the square as the radius of an arc, which then extends the length of one side of the square, from which you can develop the 1 to 1.5 ratio rectangle. It's also, interestingly enough, the way of constructing the 54.75 degree angle, which is 54 degrees and 45 minutes. Another simple construction, it was common earlier in this century, and I think known previously, but we don't pay much attention to this. But there's a sequence of root rectangles, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1 is a square, root 2 is the 1 to 1.5 proportion that gives us 54.74. Root 3 gets us to 30 degrees, another common angle. So I think this used thoughtfully doesn't constrain creativity, but it offers the potential for creating a sense of repose, something that we're ultimately aware of, but it's more a feeling than sort of something that we can grasp immediately, other than it gives us some comfort. To talk more about pragmatism, and it was touched on in the Lloyd quote, if you have a roof of 54.75 degrees, when you turn the corner to create a hip with that slope equally on both sides, the hip rafter, the hip itself, has a slope of 1 to 1 or 45 degrees. It was common in Surrey in vernacular buildings, and I would postulate the reason is it's so simple to lay out what otherwise would be a very complicated angle. And maybe that's why you also saw it in later pyramids. My foray into whether or not one can discipline this elevation through a series of steps. I start with a rough sketch. Imagine the proportions aren't particularly accurate. This is where I'm following with Lloyd, the elements of composition, the essential rhythm of the pattern, the elementary rules which one sees had to be applied throughout the whole building or composition. The double squares, which are touched on often and used by Lutyens in both plan and in elevation as a starting point. They locate, for argument's sake, the center gable. Then you develop a central square, and that defines the peak of the 3 gables, peaks up. The geometry regulates the composition. Further subdivisions establish the eave height, which is 1/4 of the original square in height. I'm going to go back through this again in a series of steps without the underlying sketch. First, the double squares and peak is defined. Overlay a center square, define the 2 flanking peaks. The corner squares establish the peaks of the porches. The root 2 or 1 to 1.5 rectangle is a device that he uses with the corner squares because the double squares don't encompass the breadth of the entire facade. They're just the predominant portion. Here I've connected the dots for the overall outline of the roofs. And that's the fit of these steps to the final elevation. I think this opens a door into thinking about how to apply a few simple compositional tools to manage the parts with the eye on the whole. I like to think, as I said before, our brains see the relationships, and that creatively applied, they reward us with that sense of repose. This is the west elevation. I'm going to continue through this and the south elevation in the next series of slides, but I'm going to move a bit quicker because we have a lot of ground to cover. There's the sketch. Same double square, same size as in the prior elevation. A different strategy of subdivision to generate the double gable used in this elevation as opposed to the 3 on the north. This illustrates that there are other elements in the facades that are regulated by subdivisions of the major geometry. In this instance, the sill of the windows is illustrated, centered on the gables and governed by 1/2 the height of the dominant squares. This shows the introduction of the 51+ degree slope for the upper roofs, and the break line as the slope transitions to a shallower pitch at the intersection of the upper slope with the diagonal of the principal squares. Once again, connecting the relevant lines for roof slope, ridge defined by double square, the eave by the height of the quarter square of the principal square, further development for the corner piers and the extension of the porch to the north, again by the 1 to 1.5 rectangle. And again, the fit is rather good.
It's like magic.
So this is the south elevation. I'll digress from the geometry for just a second to talk about composition and materiality. It's been remarked that this appears to be a classical house emerging from the embrace of the arts and crafts. Lutyens employs ionic pilasters and white stucco detail and creates a really marvelous tension, I think, between the materiality of the arts and crafts, the tile roof, the elm clapboards, in contrast with the intellectual clarity of the classical. Now, Stuart has great observations about this sketch, which was shown to us when we visited Homewood a few years ago. And I'd like him to tell us what he found when he looked at it.
Well, Oliver showed me this drawing when we were talking about doing this lecture and explained that you'd been shown it when you went to Homewood. And my comment on it was that you can almost feel Lutyens sort of thinking aloud as he draws this building. And so many other ideas are occurring, being tried out and being discarded, or what I think happens is that he sort of sets them aside and files them away in his head and decides, no, I'm not going to use that now here at Homewood, but that's a good idea. It's an interesting idea. It's got lots of implications. Maybe I'll use it later. And in this particular elevation study, what I'm interested in, what triggered me into thinking about it was on the left-hand side of that row of 4 pilasters, which of course he eventually develops into that wonderful garden side. There is the suggestion of a squat, low proportioned arch underneath that swept down roof. And that reminded me of Monkton. And if we go to the next slide, Robin, thanks. You can see this is a drawing I did of Monkton to entertain myself in lockdown a couple of years ago. And Monkton, of course, I decided to draw it because I was quite sad that Monkton was later submerged underneath Edward James's wild surrealism. I mean, it's got its own value, that stuff, but I thought the original house was much underrated. But what we're looking at here, if we go to the next slide, is the similarity of the idea that Lutyens uses for the loggia at Monkton only a year or so later with this discarded idea for the garden side of Homewood. And I just feel like it's a really fascinating insight, not only into his method of design, but the fact that he constantly had these ideas. Sometimes he uses them, and then sometimes he just puts them away for a rainy day. Over to you again, Oliver.
Thank you. All right, up back to this double square. Same one used in the others. Then we have the 45-degree triangle, some of our basic pre-CAD drafting kit, and the 30-60 triangle as well. Again, locating this corner piers based on successively smaller squares in the corner. That locates the porches. Next slide. And again, by connecting the lines, we establish the eaves and the porches, especially the large horizontal, long upper horizontal eave where the elevation peels back. And there's the final elevation with the overlay.
I feel like you should say voila.
What I should say is I find this immensely satisfying. It's really is what it is. And then even more satisfying, I think, is the next slide for me, which is I took it and I dropped it on top of the sketch that we were just talking about. And the consistency and sort of accuracy of this, as well as his underlying sketch that really retains this geometry despite the evolution of the facade to something that's quite different from this at the end of the day, I think is really remarkable. And I love this insight, this window into Lutyens' process. I think it's really very satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're looking at, to use Robert Lutyens' words, is the armature of the design, isn't it? It really is.
I think so. Though I found it impenetrable. Okay. All right, very good. So let's go to Middlefield. Thank you, Stuart.
Okay, Middlefield, this is one of my favorite of Lutyens' houses. It combines Lutyens' growing interest in classical symmetry with Georgian detail. And unlike, say, Heathcote of a couple of years before, it relies entirely on its qualities of mass and symmetry and proportion for its success. The critic Gavin Stamp, who's one of the great writers on Lutyens, I think, called it a masterpiece of austere beauty, which it certainly is in my view. Lutyens has been progressively stripping away of everything but the fundamentals, distilling what he saw as his own essence, the essentials of this style from, if you like, the country English Georgian originals. I think there's a sort of calmness and openness in this design, perhaps related to the open character of the site, which was described as almost bare when Lutyens arrived, and perhaps also to the cerebral, clear-minded nature of his client, who, as Robin said at the beginning, was a don at Cambridge. Next slide. So this is one of the early country life photos taken soon after completion, and it shows what Lawrence Weaver referred to as the windswept nature of the site. Importantly, I think it also shows the essentially three-dimensional nature of Lutyens' design here, and the perfect suavity of the lines of the roofs, all kept in harmonious and unbroken planes. With the, what can I call it, the sort of tower-like bulk of those chimneys, which dominate the design and peg it down, but they don't overawe it, and the beautiful interrelation of the different masses. The materials of the building, unlike, say, something like Tigbourne, which kind of revels in its varied materials, or even Homewood, where they're used as part of the actual contrast of ideas. Here, if you like, the entire building, apart from very small details, is made of clay, either in the form of the roof tiles or in the form of the bricks, set in thick-lined mortar. And they're very small bricks, almost Tudor in character, and they give a slightly rustic, kind of soft character to the walls, but they also allow kind of crispness of edges, and appropriate in this part of England, which lacks a good local building stone. There's a strong sense of harmony and geometric relation. which I think is implied rather than over-explained or demonstrated. Again, we see simple squares controlling the main line of the design. There's the double square, which can be detected here just as Oliver found it at Homewood. The next slide shows that 3060 rectangle shaded in blue, which, as we know from what Oliver said earlier, is also a root 3 rectangle, and that defines the center of the facade. And I'm going to hand over to Oliver now to talk about the next few aspects of this wonderful house.
Well, one of the things that I noted about this, and we were discussing a little before, and it's especially visible in the earlier black and white slide, is that the roof is absolutely continuous from the wings all the way up to the peak and over to the sides. It's disguised a little bit here, but the same peeling back and revealing of this great sort of tithe-barn roof to then produce the classical elements of the and Georgian composition of the facades. Terrific. And again, we see the geometry. It inspires and disciplines the composition of shapes. There's the counterbalance of the large rectangular windows with small round ones. And there's a sense of regularity and visual stability of the central section. And that contrasts with the sort of top heaviness of this roof. But I think in the overall, it's in proportion to the rest of the facade. Next. Here again, you see how the arc and the diagonal locate elements like the tops of the chimneys in this instance. And again, I think that in our brains, we process these relationships. Next. Another arc, another play with the geometry. You see here how the ridge is established off the height of the central square. The main ridge line is a root 2 relationship based on the secondary square sitting on the roof's eave line. Next. And finally, I think the very important lower eaves line is defined by a further diagonal and arc.
Beautiful. Yeah, and while we're looking at, if we can go back to that slide, Robin, just momentarily. And just it's worth pointing out in this building that feels so classical that white painted central door frame is the only overtly classical detail on the whole building. And also this is a good moment to talk about the fact that Lutyens never minded much about form following function when designing these kinds of elevations, because the big window on the right is the main stairs, and the balancing big window on the left actually lights the bathroom. So if we go on to the next slide, we can look at the garden side. The whole character of the design changes here. It kind of unbuttons its shirt. It becomes a bit more relaxed, more open, and a much greater sense of the horizontal. The solid to void ratio is quite different, but it's fascinating how Lutyens manages to achieve this modulation in how the design feels without departing from any of his organizing geometry that he established on the other side, on the entrance front. And in this drawing, I've highlighted the roofs to show how Lutyens manipulates them to create the character of these two sides. On the north side at the top, like Oliver said, there's a much greater sense of that sort of all-enveloping canopy of the roof, swept low and pegged down by the powerful verticals of the chimneys, almost like some kind of enormous hat that's sort of pulled down over the building in the kind of chilly Cambridge winds blowing across that steppe-like farmland that we saw. And on the south side, the eaves is kept level and emphasizes the horizontal. And here the sheer size of that main roof is more apparent. And it has an odd effect where you're more aware of the size of the building, but because the roof is so big in relation to the wall below, it kind of minimizes the scale of the wall, which is an interesting, slightly tense effect, I think. And then in the next few slides, we'll see that just as we saw on the north side, and like I just mentioned, there's the strong controlling geometry underpinning Lutyens' kind of artistic decisions. So here's a different set of double squares. And there again, the controlling √3 rectangle in the center of the facade, which is exactly the same rectangle that we saw from the center of the north elevation. And next. So here are those same geometries applied on the actual photograph. And of course, in reality, the very thick and very characteristic white painted glazing bars to the windows, they give a sort of graphic quality, a very crisp contrast with the slightly rustic brickwork and the dark brown of the roofs. Interestingly, when we were researching this, I noticed in Weaver, he referred to the original intention to add pergolas to the garden on this side, running out from the loggia on the right and the study window on the extreme left. And I think from what it says that these would have enclosed the garden more or less on the line of the yew hedges that we can see in the photo. And this drawing shows, again, how on this side, I think that what Lutyens does is he does not break his horizontal lines, and therefore they are dominant, and we feel them as dominant, and they anchor the building down. When the verticals are still there, of course, but less emphatic. And again, the √3 rectangles create the whole dimension and proportion of that central facade, not only in the middle, but also the bay window sections on either side. And interestingly, this time they're actually overlaid by implied squares centered on those bays. And they, if you think about them, once you've noticed them, they feel like sort of stout piers that are supporting that enormous roof above. And again, at the risk of slightly overdoing this, but just showing you that there are as many of these squares as you care to go looking for, really. They're there all the time. And there are actually other echoes of proportion between the walls, roofs, and chimneys, highlighted in black between that bay window and the diagonal across the roof, same proportion, and in pale blue across the whole of that garden facade, and from the corner of the roof right up to that opposing chimney. And like Oliver said before, I think that we sort of feel rather than see these relationships, but they give an element of harmony and certainty of repetition without boredom. That brings us to Gledstone, which was completed in 1925. It's been described as one of Lutyens' finest and most sensitive houses, and was described by his biographer Butler as a work of art worthy of being listed one day as a national monument. And of course, it is now Grade 1 listed. Hussey commented that the entrance elevation, this one on the north side, has a grandeur more French than English, restrained and sober, and in his view, entirely successful. And all the lines of the design seem to converge on that portico in front of us, which is the only portico, the full-blooded portico that Lutyens ever designed in an English house. And of course, that great long, steep stretch of roof, which is at the 54-45 pitch that Oliver mentioned earlier. Next. The organization of these two elevations is it at its basis very simple. The facade has a central portico and two flanking side wings, which is just an arrangement of 3 squares. And they are set at a distance from each other, defined by another of these 30-60 or √3 rectangles. Next. And again, the square and double square relationship is used to define the height of the whole elevation, including the chimneys. When we look at center lines in what is, after all, an entirely symmetrical building, and it's very important, this just growing use of symmetry, we can see the contrast between the garden side, which is here at the top, and the entrance side at the bottom. On the garden side, there are numerous repeated center lines and minor center lines and lots of French doors, whereas on the entrance side, there is just that single central focus. And you've got one place to go in, but once you're in the house, you've got many options for getting out into that garden on the south side. Next slide. Here I'm trying to highlight again the contrast between the character of the two sides of the house. So at the top, on the garden side, the house becomes, well, within the context of its quite formal design, if you like, a bit more intimate, a bit more domestic. The scale drops a bit with those loggias and the green painted shutters, which soften the feeling of the scheme. While meanwhile, on the north side, we're strongly aware of the voids within that portico, and more subtly aware of the fact that what Lutyens does by flanking that portico is he breaks his wall very slightly forward of the rest of the facade to build a sense of crescendo towards that portico. Highlighted in orange here is the stone wall on that north facade between those strangely tall elongated windows, which creates the visual sensation that each of these is actually a stone pier. And when I looked at this, I realized that each of these piers is exactly the same width across the whole facade, including between the windows in the end wings and right the way through the portico itself. So it doesn't even allow the side wings a central window at all, and it deprives them of any kind of assertiveness visually. And what I think Lutyens is doing with this is he gives the portico a sort of resonance, or a sense that the effect of the portico is like repercussive across the whole facade. It's like a ripple dropping from a pebble in a pond. So it's not a long elevation with a portico that happens to be tacked onto it, but an organic whole, a bit like we saw right at the beginning at Tigbourne, where everything is related to the decisions made about the central and even the subsidiary features in the design. So here's a photograph in reality of that north side. What's hard to appreciate is also that, like a lot of his other late designs, the walls here are slightly battered, leant back, Lutyens' version of entasis that we're familiar with in columns, which again reinforces the feeling of integration between the portico and the walls and enhances the sense of the solidity and mass overall. And again, Lutyens doesn't feel tied to his window shapes and sizes following the interior arrangement at all. The taller upper windows suggest a piano nobile, which just absolutely isn't the case. And in fact, the upper floor is more or less at the windowsill level of those first four windows. There's a wonderful quote in Butler where he says, "Strict adherents of truth will be shocked to find no difference between the windows of the grand staircase, a bedroom, bathroom, or even a linen room." And then finally on the south side, we see the effect of those other decisions. The facade is still formal, still symmetrical, but slightly more relaxed. What I think Gavin Stamp called sturdiness veiled in refinement. And a subtle touch is the contrast that Lutyens brings between the narrower central chimneys and the wider ones at the side, in the same way as he drew a very subtle distinction between his chimneys at Middlefield. And I think this is our final slide, which I think shows how Lutyens is able to bring a little taste of Italy to the North York moors.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. Let's see if we've got some questions and answers. Horner Davis wants to know how each of you adapt these rules to your practice and how does this interact with CAD? Could it be applied to a system to generate more satisfying production buildings or dwellings?
Oliver.
Oh, I was going to toss it to you. You're quicker than I am. You know, the thing for me about this is, this has all been, every time I start looking at Lutyens and his work, I see things that I've never seen before or was only vaguely alert to, which is why this is probably more fun for me than it is for anybody else who's listening. Only in the most rudimentary fashion. And I think, we rely on instinct a lot. And what I see is this is something that even at my advanced age, I would like to add into my toolkit and spend more time thinking about it.
Yeah, I would go, and I think that if you want any kind of grasp of it, sometimes there's freedom through limitation. I mean, I still do all my basic drawings with an adjustable set square and on a drawing board, and when you have only access to those certain angles and easily creatable relationships, it does make you tend to refer back to them and resort to them more. And I think in all our analysis today, we can find all these relationships, but how much Lutyens sort of actively and consciously was trying to create them rather than being a byproduct of his method of design, I think is open to question.
So we have another question from Ewan Easton says, thank you so much for the talk. It's been a tremendous talk. Would we find these same guidelines on the major institutions where he was working with substantial existing buildings? It'd be interesting, Lambay or Pinhill. It'd be interesting to, one more thing for us to explore, right?
Yeah, that would be really, that would be an interesting exercise, because of course I think in adding to an existing building, he would be at least somewhat governed by the relationships that he found.
We have another question. Eve Hedema, how do you relate these classical proportions to the actual classical motifs which are used in the building, like the Palladian portico or the other more motifs? I think we commented as we're looking at Gledstone that was really basically a 5-part Palladian profile.
Especially for those little porticos in the garden, right? Those very, very much so. And I think Lutyens said plenty in letters to Baker, am I right? When he was doing Heathcote, and for his enthusiasm for embracing the game of classicism. And he alternated, I think, between feeling like one had to be a sort of obsessive about really paying attention to the rules, and then at the same time wanting to distort them and make them work in his particular personal way. So
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the buildings that we considered for inclusion in this talk was the lodges at Plumpton, where I'm pretty certain that the romantic side of Lutyens would have conceived of how great it would be to give that house the gatehouse that it lacked, that Elizabethan manor house. At the same time as the more intellectual side of him, once he decided to have the romantic conception of those classical details on a vernacular building, would then have just gone to town on making sure that it absolutely made mathematical sense in terms of the framework of the building in its geometry.
yeah, and it's a perfect example of his use of the double square and plan, because they're absolutely rigorously laid out.
Absolutely.
Nigel Hammett asked, is the use of the golden rectangle visible in the elevations? And I'll just follow with another question. Manuel Murgal says, I set my adjustable triangle to phi, the golden ratio, but after this presentation, I will think about using a 30, 60, and 45 more. So. Do
you want to talk on the golden ratio side
of
things?
I think what I was interested in is the possibility that there was a sort of really simple sequence that, rather than looking for particular, then there's a tension there between trying to superimpose the relationships, but we've done it before. And when we spent some time a couple of years back in the sort of the first quarter of the pandemic, maybe, when we did talk about plans, it was certainly evident in his plans, and I imagine it's evident in elevations too.
Yeah.
I think the idea that the takeaway for me was, if his double squares need extra space, because he's not looking to encompass everything within them, and he may not even use the double squares, but if he wants to elbow out and expand the length of something, he'll discipline it with some device. If root 2 doesn't get him far enough, I can imagine him going to something like the golden section or something else. He just wants to discipline it with a repeatable geometry.
I think it's also worth saying that that article that you found about Leicester and Memorial Arch, Oliver, they referred to something in there called Pell numbers.
Right.
And numbers develop from the root 2 relationship in the same way that the Fibonacci sequence tends towards the golden mean. And
Right.
if our question is interested in that, and the fact that Lutyens did seem to use that root 2 relationship a lot, they could go and look for that.
And Lloyd, the draftsman, hints at that with his fantastical fractions, because those numbers, the Fibonacci, et cetera, they're indeterminate. So I think he may be meaning exactly that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's right.
And then I'm going to pass along the last comment by Manuel again. Do you know if he used these proportions with Jekyll in the design of the gardens as well? There's another webinar. So I'll turn over to you, Martin.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed to Oliver and Stuart. You certainly, for me, and I hope for our audience, you demonstrated how Lutyens had come to believe in early in his career in the discipline of strict geometry. And he started applying these principles to his vernacular buildings before proceeding on to his classical mode, and even more so in his abstract styles later on. I'd like also to say thank you to all of the attendees. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you are not already members, do please consider joining either the Lutyens Trust in America or the Lutyens Trust here in the UK. We'd love to have you as members, and it's very easy to join on one or other of our websites. So thank you again, speakers. Thank you, Robin, also for keeping the speakers under control. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.